Night does not fall softly on a city at war. It comes like a curtain tugged too hard, leaving lamps to shiver in the wind and voices to echo in the corridors between stone and sea. In the early summer of 430 BC, Athens glowed with that kind of uneasy darkness, a city brilliant enough to be seen from the far beaches of the Saronic Gulf, and yet unable to sleep. Between the long walls, 250,000 heartbeats gathered, cramped and sweating behind battlements that ran like veins to the harbour. Farmers had abandoned their fields to the torch of Spartan raiders. Shepherds brought their flocks into courtyards meant for festivals, not for bleating. Children pressed their faces to stair rails, learning the geometry of city life the hard way, measuring the distance between fear and relief in the sound of their father's footsteps coming home late. Pericles had asked them to bear it. He believed the walls would save them, the sea would feed them, and their ships would sting the enemy wherever the land-bound Spartans could not reach. He promised that Athens, quick-witted, sea-born, ringed with stone and crowned with temples, could outlast any siege the Peloponnesians cared to stage. So they waited behind their walls, that mile-wide breathless corridor of stone and dust stretching from the upper city to Piraeus. And waiting is its own kind of war. By day the harbour boiled, black ship hulls nudged each other like restless cattle, oars glinted in bundles, bronze rams sat like shark teeth under tarps, and hawsers creaked as triremes rocked against the quays. Fishmongers bellowed past barrels of pickled catch. Potters hauled stacks of bowls to the markets that never seemed to close. Strangers were everywhere, Boeotians with calloused hands, islanders still smelling of salt, metics with the calculating eyes of people who make do far from home. In the taverns the talk ran like spilled wine. How soon would the Spartans pull back? How many ships sailed for the next raid? Could the city keep bread cheap through another season? Somewhere in that noise something else arrived. At first it was a rumour that clung to Piraeus like fog, a man staggering ashore after a voyage from Egypt, heated and glassy-eyed. A boy flushed and shaking, tugged by his mother through the market before they vanished down an alley. A sailor who lay on the planks near his ship and complained of a dryness in the mouth he could not slap away with water or wine. A priestess who did not come out for the morning rites. In a city that traded with the world, sickness often rode in as quietly as a passenger does, eyes down, cloak drawn, carrying a small bundle that caused no notice until too late. The physicians arrived with seriousness and oil flasks, with knives for cupping and jars of herbs. They pressed fingers to wrists and recited the balances of humours, tried steam and baths and careful bleeding. They were learned men, confident and well paid, and then they began to die. Not all of them, never all, but enough that superstition slipped its fingers into the city's collar. "The wells," someone said in the tangle of streets. "The Spartans poisoned the wells at Piraeus." The rumour ran along the long walls, scratched at the gates and filled courtyards with whispers. But soldiers drank and did not fall. Priests blessed the water and still watched neighbours burn with fever. The truth did not care for blame. It only cared for bodies. A young historian with sharp eyes and a soldier's restraint watched this unfold. He would be struck down himself and survive. Later he would write the account that carried the story across the centuries. But in those first days, Thucydides was still gathering the shape of it, listening as the city's sound changed pitch. There is a moment when an outbreak isn't a rumour anymore, when the streets perform a new music. Doors close more carefully, a cough is measured, counted. The marketplace grows a hollow in its noise, a pocket where absence gathers and becomes a presence of its own. Symptoms arrived like an ambush, a heat behind the eyes, redness in the whites, a throat roughened as if lined with grit, then choking, sneezing, a cough that seemed to come from deeper than lungs. Breath turned foul, and even the most gentle women cursed at the air as if it had betrayed them. Stomachs revolted. Vomit came in waves, green-black and stubborn. The skin erupted, small angry blisters, then ulcers, little dark islands in a sea of fever. And thirst that mocked the cup. Men crawled to fountains and lay with mouths open under spouts. They slept not at all, or if they drifted, they flinched awake, restless, their minds slipping free of the ropes of custom. After 7 days or 8, many simply went out like lamps, starved of oil. Those who lived past that often found their hands, feet, even their sight permanently altered. as if the sickness had left a signature claiming a piece of them. The city began to change its manners. Athens had been a place of laws. Yes, fierce and argumentative, but deeply ritualized. The dead were to be washed, dressed, carried with words and gestures that bound grief to meaning. Suddenly there were too many bodies and too few hands. Funeral pyres were seized, funerals stacked atop funerals, and family lines tangled on the hillside as one procession arrived while another burned. Fathers mourned sons, and then were carried to the same fires in the same week. Clay jars in the cemeteries filled with the remains of the nameless, because names take time to speak, and time was too expensive. The law would return, but for now grief spilled beyond the polite channels. People survived however they could. They inhaled quickly and shared space and food without counting the cost. Virtue and vice were no longer neat arrangements. They were improvisations under duress. Pericles moved through this chaos with the gravity of a man used to speaking for a city. He had called Athenians to greatness so often that the marble itself seemed to hum with it, the temples standing like cords held in the air, eyes lifted to the sky. Now his speeches had to make promises to the sick as well as to the living. He told them the walls were still strong, that the Spartans would grow bored or hungry first, that the navy would pinch and bleed the Peloponnese until it begged for terms. He wore the city's confidence like a cloak, but cloaks do not hold against fever. At Piraeus, triremes still slid away into the gulf, their oars clacking in crisp unison. The sailors' hands bled on the wooden handles, the rhythm drummed into their bones, and the bronze rams curled forward with manic patience, hungry for timber and flesh. Every victory returned with its own shadows, ships docking to cheers while the gangways offered up men who wobbled or shivered, men who had seen the enemy cut loose and run, and yet could not keep food down the following morning. Glory came home with a cough. The plague did not care about the city's genius. It moved along the same lines that made Athens powerful: trade routes, crowded streets, the closeness of people who believed in each other enough to live on top of each other. It climbed stairs, one railing at a time. It passed bowls of figs by the handful. It rode the back and forth of kisses and tears. It loved the heat, the way summer turns stone into a griddle and wind into a hot knife. When a city's memory is strong, it can hold more suffering before it shatters. The Athenians had memory in spades, Salamis marathon, men who had stood in line with shields touching as if they were links in a living wall. They knew what it meant to lose and to win. But disease writes a different kind of history. There are no trumpets, no trophies, no poets chanting in the mix of dust and sunlight. There is only the steady arithmetic of bodies. And yet, within the arithmetic, there were still human stories stubborn as olive roots. A mother who wrapped her feverish daughter in a wet cloth and whispered old lullabies. A slave who carried his master to a physician and then stayed in the doorway all night, head resting on knees because there had been kindness once, and that memory outweighed the risk. A physician who returned to a street where two of his patients had already died because the third was not dead yet, and skill is a promise. These were not heroes in the epic sense. They were the sort of people who keep civilization from sliding entirely into the sea. As the days grew hotter, the sickness climbed out of Piraeus and into the city's heart, across the agora's stone slabs, past the painted stoa where arguments usually glittered like fish. It rose the slope toward the Acropolis, where the goddess looked over her city with that terrible, beautiful calm carved into her face. It threaded itself into the prayers offered in cool side chambers, into the shadows of columns. A city that had perfected the art of being together now suffered for that very perfection. By the time the cicadas began their rasping chorus, the plague was no longer an interruption. It was the season itself. Dawn in Athens began to sound different. The chorus of sellers calling out olives and barley, the clack of sandals on stone. These were still there, but thinner, as if heard through fabric. A hush crept into the streets even at noon, a waiting hush, the kind that precedes a summer storm. Men who had once greeted each other with polished words now nodded and moved on, as though language itself might carry contagion. In the shaded colonnades of the agora, debate, the lifeblood of a city that trusted the voice, collapsed into brief exchanges and wary glances. The plague did not merely steal breath, It stole the willingness to stand close and be human. Thucydides watched and set down his notes. He wrote as a soldier writes, without perfume, and yet his sentences carry the heat of the rooms he described. He tells of eyes inflamed, of sneezing that opened into a violent cough, of chests aching as if scraped clean. He speaks of bile, of a hiccup like a cruel puppet master tugging the strings of the ribs, of small pustules and livid blotches overrunning the skin. He remembers the thirst that mocked relief, the delirium that made men fling themselves into cisterns, fountains, baths, anything cool enough to promise momentary peace. He remembers that doctors, standing too near their patients, died quickly for their kindness. He remembers the birds and dogs, scavengers by nature, keeping their distance from the dead, as though even hunger knew a boundary here. And still the ships came and went. War does not politely pause for plague. It crowds in greedy, asking for the same energies and the same boys. Triremes left Piraeus tight with muscle, the ore banks smelling of pitch and sweat. They returned with rumors of Spartan alarms along the coast, of villages set ablaze, of captured cargoes salted away in the city's stores. But amid the cheers, there was always the grim roll call on the docks. Another crewman shaking, another helmsman gone to fever, another herald speaking too softly a list of those who would not collect their pay. Relief was a religion in Athens long before this pestilence, rituals to please gods who were famously proud and particular. Now the temples filled with suppliants, bodies pressed to cold stone, garlands wilting on columns under the weight of grief, incense wrestling the reek of sickness, priests chanting, hands lifted, faces composed with an effort that strained the muscles around the eyes. But the plague snuffed candles and hope alike. Suppliants died in the sanctuaries and lay there for hours, then days, until mourners and porters could be found to move them. Sacred space, once an island of purity, became another harbor for the disease. It is hard to keep the divine unsullied when the human is everywhere suffering. Customs cracked. Law, that hard-won Athenian pride, softened and ran like wax in the heat. Funerals, those careful threads binding the living to the dead, knotted and broke. If a family's pyre was delayed, another family might hurry their own body onto it, pleading necessity and the mercy of speed. Ceremonies shortened, laments shortened, courtesy shortened. Men who once spoke of immortality in the theatre now judged a day fortunate if it ended with all the household breathing. Wealth lost its sheen because there was less future to spend it in. The poor broke into storerooms, the rich abandoned caution. Thieves and benefactors sometimes wore the same cloak. A city that treasured moderation lurched as if drunk toward the immediate. Yet within the tilt, patterns formed. Those who had recovered from the sickness, scarred and thinner but upright, moved among the sick with a new authority. They were called upon to nurse, to carry, to stand vigil. Thucydides hints at immunity, the first cold glimmer of a truth that would take millennia to name. To endure the disease was to be armed against it. These survivors walked the lanes with a tired pride, as if carrying invisible shields. They were not fearless, they were simply located beyond a particular kind of fear. Pericles kept speaking. He climbed the bema and spoke to a crowd that packed itself close in defiance of its own caution, a crowd that needed the shape of hope pronounced over them. He reminded them who they were, the city that laid down fleets like a card player lays down aces, that wrote its name on the water. He argued for steadiness, no reckless charges, no bargaining with Spartan pride. The short war, he implied, is Sparta's dream. The long war will be Athens' reality and advantage. The walls would endure, the navy would harry, the allies would hold. But speeches cannot feed children. Bread lines thickened and shortened in the same hour, prices bucked like frightened animals. Metics, who had believed Athens would always be the safest bet in Greece, found themselves counting coins with a gambler's care. In cramped apartments, farmers from the countryside shared pallets with cousins and strangers. Coughing travelled the room the way laughter once had. In the quarters near the ships, sailors smudged their faces with oil to keep the salt from spitting their skin open, and then lay awake listening to the fever talk of the man on the next mat. There were small mercies. A neighbour who left a bowl of figs at a door and knocked only once. A stonemason who paused his work to carry a body down 3 flights because the daughter was too slender to manage it alone. A chorus of young men who, 2 months earlier, had sung drinking songs, now singing a low plain chant outside the house of a friend who was not expected to see morning. In the drafty rooms where citizens met to decide policy, there were moments when voices sharpened in anger, and then softened, caught by the sight of a face pale with exhaustion. Pericles, too, was not untouchable. He had weathered raids, storms, and accusations. He had passed laws that squeezed citizenship until it shone with exclusivity. He had lifted the city's gaze with marble and hymn. Now the plague reached into his house and took 2 sons from him, the legitimate branches of his line. He stood at their funerals, a man accustomed to building the city as future forced to look down into the ash of his own. The city watched, and even those who loathed his policies drew closer in their hearts, because grief recognizes grief, and leadership lived beside them in that firelight. There is a story that a friend visiting Pericles as fever gnawed at him saw a charm hung around his neck, some small superstitious remedy he would once have dismissed with a half-smile. If the tale is true, it shows what plague does even to the rational. It drives the wise toward any shore that looks like land. The most disciplined mind will reach for anything that feels like a rope. The Spartans, hearing of the sickness, did not press closer into the city. They were men of land and suspicion and kept their distance. Their annual ravaging of Attica cut the countryside again and again, but they withdrew sooner, unwilling to linger within a sickness's shadow. The war bent a little around the disease's invisible radius. Seasons turned and the plague did not end. It abated, then returned, as if the city were breathing it in and out. Some years it was a whisper, other years a shout. Between waves, Athenians tried to patch their customs, to sweep clean and rehang garlands, to argue again about theatre and tax and the treatment of allies. But even in those intervals, the city felt altered, the way a recovered limb moves differently after a deep wound, a stiffness at the hinge, a missing grace. War remained, insistent as heat. The Peloponnesian conflict, already a grand grinding of wills and resources, took on a new, sour taste. Politics sharpened. When food is short and funerals frequent, the precise angle of policy can cut men's hearts. Pericles' steady, slow-handed strategy looked to some like indifference in the face of suffering. Demagogues learned the city's newly heightened pitch and played it. Cleon rose, speaking with a butcher's certainty, promising action where patience felt like surrender. The assembly, restless, listened and at times followed. Athens could still be generous, granting honors, sending relief, but it could also turn hard as though pain had thickened its blood. Pericles' own final illness took him in the 2nd year. The city that had often seemed an extension of his will now stood as a mirror to his mortality. He who had designed the long game would not live long enough to see how it played. There were no thunderous last words, only the human business of breath failing in a quiet room, while the city beyond the shutters continued to carry water, argue, mourn, and plan. When he died, Athens did not fall silent. It could not afford to. But something in its tone changed. The careful moderation that had been his hallmark loosened. The city began, slowly, to chase bolder gambles, to follow louder voices, to mistake motion for strategy. The plague had not only thinned the ranks, it had altered the temperament of the survivors. People who have watched the world tilt toward randomness often become impatient with slow wisdom. And yet Athens remained Athens, brilliant even when broken, argumentative even when exhausted, capable of greatness in the very hour it courted disaster. The plague had not conquered the city in the crude sense. The walls still stood, the ships still cut the gulf. But something had cracked beneath the marble sheen, a hairline fracture invisible to tourists that would widen under later pressures. A distant island, as tempting grain, a silver-tongued general's dream, a harbour far to the west glittering with false promise. For now the summer heat throbbed against the stone. In courtyards, mothers soaked cloths in cool water and told stories of calmer days. In workshops, apprentices tried to remember where their masters kept the good chisels. In barracks, young men cleaned their shields with a deliberate care because ritual steadies the heart. Above them all, the Acropolis basked in the last honeyed light of evening. The goddess looked down, not indifferent, but eternal, and the city inhaled, held that breath, and faced the long night. Night after night, the city adjusted to its altered heartbeat. In the lanes beneath the Acropolis, where the lamps hung low and the air held the faint smell of thyme and ash, the people who endured learned new rituals. They cleaned door latches with vinegar. They slept in shifts so a steady hand could hold a cup to a fevered mouth. They hammered together rough biers from old planks and kept a pile of pitch-soaked rags ready for when the whisper between breathing and not breathing crossed its thin line. The plague had taught them a blunt tenderness, inelegant, direct, almost wordless. Survival became a craft, and the city became a workshop of small salvations. Thucydides, cool as a blade left in shade, drew out the darker consequence, a loosening of the city's moral ligaments. When tomorrow is uncertain, the calculus of virtue shifts. Men spent inheritances as if coins might birth comfort now or never. Laws, once revered as instruments of collective honor, were stepped around or over in the name of necessity. Oaths grew a second language, the language of exceptions. Not everyone fell into license, many kept their souls on a tight rein. But the proportion changed. Athenian moderation, that proud balance between appetite and discipline, began to sway on its feet. The theatre felt the tremor. Tragedy had always faced sickness and fate with an unblinking gaze. Now it seemed to speak from the very heat of the hour. The chorus, masked and measured, could not help but echo a city's new knowledge that the air itself might carry doom. A rumor ran that somewhere, in a play that made the old myths walk across the stage like neighbors, a king's city suffered a plague because truth hid in plain sight. Whether or not the first performance aligned with the first summer of disease, the theme felt inevitable. Athens was a living stage where suffering demanded interpretation. Art answered like a bell struck in fog. It could not dispel the mist, but it made the shape of the unseen audible. War kept grinding. The navy proved again and again that a city without broad fields could wield a continent. Reach, landing, burning, vanishing, forcing the Spartans to watch the sea with a new humility. At Pylos the improbable happened. Spartan hoplites, that iron of the Peloponnese, were taken alive on Sphacteria. Athens roared with astonishment and pride. For a moment, it felt as if the gods had nodded their heads in the city's direction again, as if the balance begun to tip during the fever might right itself. In the markets, victory stories flared like torches against the memory of funerals. But beneath the glitter, something remained altered. In assembly, amid the shout and counter-shout that were the city's own music, caution sounded less persuasive. The measured architects of policy, the men who carried Pericles tempering in their bones, found themselves outsung by voices that promised the brighter and nearer harvest. Cleon's zeal, practical to some, punitive to others, gained ground. In the Mytilenean debate, the city lurched one way, then the other, clever enough and restless enough to think twice in a single night about the scale of its anger. The capacity for reconsideration was a kind of health. The ferocity with which extremes were uttered was a symptom. Athens could still pull back from a cliff, but it had begun to dance closer to edges, breathing fast. Years folded. The plague, like an unwelcome season with its own timetable, returned and retreated, marking the city the way waves mark a shore, not with one blow, but with a repetition that wears. With each recurrence the survivors knew more: how to wet a cloth, when to stop forcing food, which words comforted and which simply drained the mouth of moisture. They also knew the cost, the way memory itself could tire, the way the future dimmed an inch after each wave. Children grew up thinking the presence of sickness was part of the weather. When a generation learns to keep its joys light-footed, it may take bigger risks to feel them. So when the West glittered, the name of a great island rising like a star over the sea lanes, its plains rumored rich, its harbors wide, Athens listened. A young general with easy charm traced a dream on the city's imagination, a campaign that would enlarge what was already extraordinary, a gesture that would turn the map itself into a tribute to Athenian nerve. The city's older sense, Pericles' patient, ocean-slow strategy, had lost its chief custodian. His heirs, unable to speak with his authority or perhaps unwilling to ask for more endurance from a tired public, argued, and were argued down. The expedition was voted, then expanded, launched with more pomp than prudence. Wine splashed, oars bit water, prayers smoked upward. That story belongs elsewhere in its full tragedy. But notice the hinge. A city touched by plague had also been touched by impatience. Grief can make a people tender. It can also make them desperate for a scene in which suffering ends in sudden reward. The ships that curved westward carried the best of Athens, its cunning, courage, music of command, and also its crack, a willingness to gamble for a kind of healing that strategy alone could not offer. In the homes that did not discuss policy, the plague's legacy was counted in smaller measures. The old woman on the corner, blind in one eye since the fever took its toll, recognized voices faster than faces and kept a list in her head of who owed who bread. The carpenter's son, once built like a stone jar, had fingers cramped into claws. He apprenticed to a scribe, learning a different craft with a furious precision as if to punish his own body for weakness. A sailor's wife in Piraeus could pick from the sound of a cough whether she needed water, blanket, or the fast runner to fetch a priest. Athens had always been a school. Now it had a second curriculum, taught in kitchens and on thresholds, unforgettably practical. And the gods. They did not explain. Altars were repaired, processions rethreaded their routes, sacrifices smoked sweetly on festival mornings, but the city's relationship with the divine had been complicated by the silence of those early summers. Faith endured, but it wore a new humility. If disasters come not for a reason, but with a root, then holiness is no guarantee against geography. Strangers at the port, Phoenicians with violet-dyed fingers, Egyptians with linen wrapped just so, had always taught Athens that the world was larger than the Attic plain. The plague taught that the world was also more porous, its distances sneaking into each other. Thucydides left us no cure. He left us a pattern. He wrote of how the sickness may have come from beyond the known horizon, how it threaded Egypt and Libya before it found Athens, how the cities teeming together, which made it glitter, also made it vulnerable. He captured the psychological aftershock without dressing it in false nobility, that men cherished the present because the future had become a rumor. His pages smell of ash and salt, but there is also in them a stubborn light, the light of observation itself, which is a form of respect for reality. By the time peace first limped into view, a generation had married and buried under the same shadow. There were youth who had only ever known a city on its guard, and elders who had learned to measure their talk to the endurance of their lungs. Athens had not vanished. Astonishingly, it continued to mint beauty and argument at a pace that would have bewildered other peoples. The Parthenon still drew sunlight like a net. Philosophers still teased from air and earth a series of questions that would train the thought of millennia. The city's ships still gave the gulf its geometry. And yet, the unbroken confidence, that tight braid of destiny and discipline, had frayed. Stand now, if you like, in imagination on the hill at dusk. The cicadas are insistent, the air still baked, the stone warm beneath your sandal. Below, the city spills to the sea in angles and light. You can pick out the line of the long walls like a thought cast into distance. Everywhere signs of life, smoke from cook fires, the flash of bronze at a gate, the thrum of a song half remembered. This is not a defeated place. It is a wounded place that has chosen repeatedly to live. A distinction worth the breath it costs to say it aloud. The plague that broke Pericles Athens did not raise the city in an afternoon. It bent it. It stole leaders and loosened habits. It shortened tempers and lengthened the reach of chance. It taught survival and tempted recklessness. It revealed that a community's strength is more than walls and ships. It is also the invisible tissue that runs between handshake, ritual, patience, and law. Split that tissue, and even marble weeps. Centuries later, the stones remain. Tourists walk where Thucydides listened. Scholars turn the pages he filled as carefully as if they were thin vases. Schoolchildren learn the names, Pericles, Cleon, Nicias, as if they were strokes in a single character. But if you kneel and press your hand to the steps of a temple at evening, when shadows make the old chisel marks visible, you might feel beneath the coolness a thrum that is not entirely the wind. It is the record of a city that was brave enough to continue in the face of breath taken away. It is the echo of mothers and sailors and masked choruses and exhausted physicians who held the thread when it seemed to be fraying to nothing. We inherit their lesson, that human brilliance is not a shield but a tool, that hope must be husbanded like grain, that patience is a strategy, not a confession of weakness, that kindness practiced one door at a time is policy of the most durable kind, and if somewhere there is a leader whose plan depends upon the steadiness of a people's mind, the story of Athens whispers a warning as intimate as a hand on a shoulder. Guard the soul of the city as fiercely as its walls. The goddess still gazes, indifferent to our need for conclusions. The sea still knocks its quiet knuckles against the piers. Athens breathes, so do we. And between breaths, there is time enough to remember what broke, and to choose carefully what we build next.